Did you know that as of 2017, Cabernet Sauvignon was the widest planted cultivar on the entire planet, according to the OIV? Cabernet is also the most widely planted cultivar in South Africa, although admittedly it's in a bit of a decline at the moment, at least relative to a grape like Shiraz, which is growing fast and making a play for South Africa's top red wine cultivar. Now, as of 2022, Cabernet was definitely still in the lead, but both Shiraz and Cabernet are sitting at just under 10,000 hectares each in the South African National Vineyard. Now, this is all relevant because today's hand drink solo wine of the day is the Boschkloof Cabernet Sauvignon 2021, which is a wine made by a winemaker famous for his Syrah or Shiraz in a region which is famous for its Cabernet Sauvignon. Boschkloof is a wine estate in the Polkadraai Hills ward of Stellenbosch, South Africa. Now, Stellenbosch is considered to be the absolute epicenter of Cabernet culture in South Africa. The Polkadraai Hills are an elevated subsection on the western half of Stellenbosch, and it's one of the regions where Shiraz or Syrah is fighting hardest to dethrone Stellenbosch Cabernet as its most lauded wine category. As it stands, Polkadraai Hills deliver some of South Africa's most lauded red wines, including Syrah from Damascene Wines, Lucas van Lagerenberg, and Duncan Savage, Cabernet Francs from estates like Raats and again from Lucas van Lagerenberg, and even Bordeaux blends from estates like De Turin. But we'll talk more about those on another day. As mentioned, today's wine is made by winemaker Reenen Borman, who is a most recent addition to the Cape Winemakers Guild. Now, while being inducted into the Cape Winemakers Guild at the fresh young age of 34 is an achievement in itself, it's really just a kind of after-the-fact endorsement of some of the things that he has already been achieving on a whole number of fronts. In fact, the more I think about it, the more I come to the conclusion that Reenen Borman is a bit of a Dick Grayson type character, for three reasons. First of all, he displayed obvious talent from a very young age. Second of all, he comes from a family of savants. And third of all, he's able to express his special skills under a number of different disguises. Now, the Borman family of savants was led by the Patriarch Jacques Borman, and he bought Boschkloof Estate in 1996. And then he made wine for 14 years before in 2010, his son Reenen took over. But the significant thing here is that Jacques stayed on as viticulturist, which means today he's sitting on almost 30 years of connection to the Boschkloof land and their vineyards. As we've said before, that connection between the land, the vineyards, and the person who works those vineyards is incredibly important. And in a New World context, a connection of 30 years is quite rare indeed, because it has to be remembered that when we say things like great wine is made in the vineyards, this presupposes that the person working the vineyards has an intimate knowledge of the land, the vineyards, the climate, and the natural rhythms of that site. To make things complicated, the process of developing that intimate knowledge just cannot be rushed, because the pace of learning is limited by the natural rhythm of the seasons. One could go further to say that any responsibly implemented viticultural innovation or change is by definition limited to a fairly lengthy 12-month feedback loop, because one can only really know whether you're successful or not in your changes once you've tasted the wine that vintage has delivered. But back to Reenen Borman and our masked vigilante analogy. Dick Grayson may have embarked on the odd caper as Robin, but he was definitely more street and edgy under the guise of Nightwing. And really, that's without us even beginning to discuss his dalliances with the disguise of Agent 37. Similarly, while Reenen's most famous get-up is as the winemaker of the Epilogue Syrah from Boschkloof, he has performed some equally heroic feats under the guise of the winemaker for the Sons of Sugarland range of wines, which make absolutely world-class Syrah, as well as a really interesting Barbera. And he also dresses up in his Kotterbosch disguise, where he makes some skin contact Chenin and some really quite stellar red Rhone-style blends. And finally, more recently, he's been getting a lot of credit for his work under the Patatsfontein wine label. And you might say, okay, we get it, he makes a lot of wine, but what about this particular wine? The Boschkloof Cabernet Sauvignon is ordinarily made entirely from Boschkloof estate fruit, but The team of Reenen and Jacques have been working really, really hard to completely rid the estate of any leaf roll virus, which means they've had to pull up a lot of their vines. And that is why the 2021 vintage is actually made from a combination of fruit from two very famous estates. We've talked about Boschkloof a little bit. The other one is Cabernet Estate, which many view to be the absolute heart of the Polkadraai Hills wine scene. So now that we know where the wine comes from, let's get into the glass and see what it's like. When we give it a sniff, well, the first thing you get is that unmistakable, crystal clear, pristine blackcurrant fruit that has almost come to define Stellenbosch Cabernet. But there's some other stuff in there as well, some slightly more savory elements. There is a very subtle touch of fresh leather, quite delightfully and more extroverted, the dried Mediterranean herbs, and even a very subtle touch of vanilla spice. And those secondary oak hints really are quite subtle in that the wine was matured for 14 months in a combination of only second, third, and fourth fill barrels. So there was no new oak on this particular wine. And when we take a sip, well, the first thing to strike you is that really concentrated blackcurrant fruit. But then straight after that, these firm but tidy chalky tannins wrap around that fruit, and the combination of concentrated fruit plus tidy tannins plus a delightful decoration of dried Mediterranean herbs all comes together to add up to textbook Stellenbosch Cabernet. Okay, so that's all we have time for today, but if you enjoyed the video, then support us on Patreon and subscribe to the Hendrik Solo YouTube channel, where we publish at least 6 videos each month on things like wine history, wine science, unusual cultivars, and some of the rising winemaking stars that are coming out of the dynamic South African wine.